Have you ever felt that you were in the right place, but still had others make you doubt that? Have you ever stayed silent in the face of injustice, not out of weakness, but out of strength? This story is for those who have been silently disbelieved, for those who carry their own name as armor. If this has happened to you or someone you know, comment here where you're watching from, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Stories like this deserve to be heard. That day, Elena Morris just wanted to cross the sky in peace. At 34, after nearly a year on a military mission abroad, she was finally heading home. She wasn't the type of person to expect recognition, but her father, retired General Harold Morris, decided that she should return with dignity. He bought a first-class ticket on the return flight from Lisbon to Atlanta. No luxury, just a quiet gesture of respect. Elena boarded with the posture that the army had taught her. Firm, silent, eyes looking straight ahead. In seat 2C, Elena carefully took off her cap and adjusted the uniform jacket over her lap. The soft leather of the seat, the quiet courtesy of the executive cabin, and the muffled sound of the airport seemed like a gift after months of sleeping on metal bunks. She sat calmly without drawing attention, but the calm didn't last long. A flight attendant, blonde, with a politely stern expression, approached with a protocol smile and a clipboard in her hands. "Excuse me, ma'am, may I check your boarding pass?" Her tone was soft, but it carried a doubt that Elena already recognized from afar. She handed over her ticket with serenity. The flight attendant read it, hesitated, looked at her again, then at the row of seats. "This is business class," she finally said. "Not as information, but as correction." Elena confirmed with a brief nod. The response was dry. "I need you to follow me. It seems there's been a mistake." Elena didn't question it. Not because she agreed, but because she had learned that sometimes silence preserves more than words. She collected her jacket, slung her backpack over her shoulders, and walked down the narrow aisle of the aircraft to the back, where a window seat awaited her. Tighter, noisier, further from where she had earned to be. No one in first class said anything. Some pretended not to notice, others simply looked away. It was a type of exclusion that didn't need to be shouted. It was enough to be ignored. As soon as she sat in the new seat, she felt the discomfort, not only physical but moral. The hard upholstery, the closeness of the other passengers, the louder hum of the engines at the back. But what truly hurt was the feeling of having been removed from a place she had earned. Elena wasn't the type to need a red carpet, but there was a line between discretion and humiliation. Quietly, she grabbed her phone and typed a short message. "Dad, they moved me. They said it was a mistake. I'm fine. Just tired." What Elena didn't know was that her father, Harold Morris, was not just a veteran with good connections. He still kept direct contact with high-ranking figures in both military and civil aviation. Upon receiving the message, he didn't reply. He simply picked up the phone and made a call. He called the right contact with the firm and direct voice that years in command had given him. Within minutes, the flight commander was informed that there was an urgent situation on board, involving a passenger identified as Sergeant Elena Morris. In the cockpit, the pilot, visibly tense, called the head of the crew, the same one who had moved Elena. Her name was Christine Adler, and at that moment she thought everything had been resolved. But upon hearing the name of the passenger, she froze. The commander was direct. "Did you relocate her? Did you check her ticket? Did you know who she was?" She hesitated. "She wasn't on the business class list. I thought maybe someone issued it wrong." The commander didn't answer immediately. He simply concluded, "You made a mistake and now you'll have to correct it publicly." Christine Adler walked back down the aisle as if each step weighed twice as much. Passengers remained distracted with movies, cell phones, or naps, unaware that something outside of protocol was about to happen. But Elena, even without knowing anything, felt it. The mood in the cabin had changed. When Christine stopped next to her, the military woman didn't immediately raise her eyes. She kept her gaze fixed on the window, as if she already knew what was coming. "Mrs. Morris," Christine began in a low, carefully chosen voice, "I need to apologize. It seems there was a misunderstanding." Elena slowly turned her face. There was no anger, just weariness and a trace of disbelief. "Misunderstanding," she repeated, almost in a whisper. Christine swallowed hard. "Your name wasn't on the list. I assumed there was some error." But your presence was valid. The commander requests that you return to your seat. It was the first time in many years of service that Christine felt the ground slip out from under her because of a passenger. It was different from dealing with difficult passengers. This was shame. There was a moment of silence. Elena took a deep breath, grabbed the folded jacket from her lap, and stood with the same serene posture as always. But before leaving the seat, she looked at Christine directly in the eyes. You didn't check the ticket. You just looked at me. The sentence came not with anger nor to embarrass. It was simply a fact, a statement that exposed more than any shout could. Some people nearby unwittingly heard. Others, noticing what was happening, paused their headphones and discreetly turned their faces. Christine couldn't respond. The walk back to first class was silent. Elena walked calmly, unhurried but firm. Seat 2C was there, empty, the same one that had been taken from her, and now it was returned, but not with honor, instead with correction. When she sat again, she adjusted her backpack under the seat and leaned back into the chair. She didn't look around. She didn't need to. Most people pretended not to see, but there was something different in the air. As if the entire cabin had realized that day the problem wasn't with the airline system. It was with the gaze of those who decide where to give a seat. As the aircraft cut through the clouds in silence, Elena looked out the window at the sky, but her mind was elsewhere. She remembered an old conversation with her father when she was still a teenager and thinking of giving up her military career before it even started. You won't always be applauded when you do the right thing, he had said, but they'll test you every time you take a place they think you don't belong. At the time, she didn't fully understand. On that flight, sitting once again in the seat that was rightfully hers, she understood with every muscle in her body. Behind the curtain that separated the classes, Christine was speaking quietly to another flight attendant, clearly shaken. I just didn't think it would turn into this. The younger colleague listened carefully. You didn't check the name on the list? Christine shook her head, almost embarrassed. It was instinctive. She didn't seem... Well, she didn't finish. She knew she didn't need to. The unspoken words weigh as much as the spoken ones. The commander went to the internal system of the aircraft and typed a preliminary report as the protocol required in cases of complaint. There was no alarm, no sirens. But what was being done there was more than bureaucratic. It was historic. For the first time in years, a superior had demanded immediate reparation for something so common and so silent that it went unnoticed on hundreds of flights worldwide every day. Back in her seat, Elena received a new bottle of water and a folded blanket, this time brought by another flight attendant. No words were exchanged, but she knew it was a symbolic gesture, small but sincere. It wasn't comfort she needed, it was recognition. And at that moment, for the first time in many hours, she breathed a little deeper. It didn't erase what had happened, but it showed that there were attentive eyes. And when there are attentive eyes, there is a chance for change. For the rest of the flight, Elena remained quiet. She read a few pages of a book she had barely been able to finish in months. But her thoughts kept returning insistently to the moment she was removed. She didn't feel surprised, and maybe that was the most painful thing. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was just another layer in a life where she had to prove herself constantly. From the military academy to civilian environments, her presence had always come with an invisible question. Are you sure you belong here? Hours later, when the plane touched down on American soil, a security officer was discreetly waiting by the disembarkation gate. It wasn't overt nor dramatic, just necessary. Christine was called to the cockpit and informed that she would need to provide formal clarification to the airline and relevant authorities. Her expression was that of someone who knew something bigger had been awakened. She looked around, as if searching for where it all began, but Elena had already left the plane. At the baggage claim area, Elena waited, her eyes fixed on the conveyor belt. Passengers moved luggage. Reunited with relatives, smiled. She just waited. The phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from her father. It's all sorted. We'll talk when you get here. I'm proud of you. Just that. No grand statements, no promises. But Elena knew that pride wasn't from the confrontation, but from the way she had handled everything, with dignity. Before leaving the airport, an airline employee approached her with an envelope in hand. Sergeant Morris, on behalf of the management, we would like to, Offer a formal apology and full transparency on the next steps. Your case is being treated with priority. Elena took the envelope but didn't open it. She simply nodded in thanks. And inside she knew that this chapter of her history wouldn't be folded in silence. On the way to the parking lot, Elena walked slowly as if each step was part of an internal landing process. The city was still waking up from its nightly sleep, and the cold morning wind touched her face with a familiarity almost. Welcome. The uniform no longer weighed as it had before. It was as if, that day, it had fulfilled yet another silent mission, exposing a flaw that so many other people silently accepted. But it wasn't just about her. Not just. It was about all the other faces that were never noticed. On the drive to her parents' house, Elena watched the buildings, the traffic lights, the faces in the cars next to hers. Everything seemed the same, but something inside her was different. The pain of exclusion wasn't new, but this time it hadn't gone unanswered. And the most important thing, she didn't need to shout to be heard. There was something powerful in the way her father had acted, and in how the justice happened almost quietly. Perhaps that was the new type of strength she was learning to cultivate. When she arrived, the front door was already open. Her father was waiting for her on the porch with a hot cup of coffee and the same look as always, the kind of look that sees everything, but doesn't press. He didn't say anything. He simply handed her the cup and motioned for her to sit down. It was his way of saying he was there, ready to listen, but on her time. Elena took a deep breath before speaking, and when she spoke, it wasn't with anger nor with tears. It was with the clarity of someone who understood on that flight the type of battle that truly matters. "I felt invisible for a few minutes, Dad," she said, "and I think what hurt the most was knowing that no one around found it strange. It seemed normal, as if seeing someone like me being moved from a place she had earned was part of the manual." Her father listened in silence. After a few seconds, he responded, "That's why it was important for you to stay calm. Sometimes the world needs us to maintain our composure, so it can't pretend it didn't see." Elena held the cup with both hands, the warmth of the coffee spreading through her fingers as a subtle reminder that she was home. She didn't need to explain. Much, her father knew in the silence between one sentence and another exactly how she had felt. But even so, she continued, "I kept thinking, how many people have been taken from their places for this same reason? Not because of an error, but because someone simply looked and thought they didn't belong." Harold nodded. "More than we imagine. But today, at least one of them returned to the right place." After the coffee, Eleanor went upstairs to her old room. The bed still had the blue comforter she used in school, and the bookshelf with military books shared space with childhood mementos. She sat on the edge of the bed and took her phone out of her pocket. Notifications were still coming through, messages from colleagues, an email from the airline, and a message from someone she hadn't seen in years, an old basemate who was now a civilian. "I saw your name on the news. Thank you for doing what I didn't have the courage to do years ago." She stared at that message for long seconds. There was no vanity, no satisfaction, just a new weight. The weight of representing something bigger than herself. She knew she wasn't the first nor the last to go through this. But in that moment, her silent gesture had become a symbol for someone, and that changed everything. It was the beginning of a new responsibility, not chosen, but accepted. The following afternoon, Harold entered her room with a black folder in his hands. He sat down next to his daughter and opened the folder on the bed. Inside were printed documents, excerpts of emails, and handwritten notes. "They're starting to set up a committee on discriminatory conduct within commercial aviation. They asked for recommendations. And I told them the best person for this was already here." Elena looked at him, surprised. "Me? Who better to help change this system than someone who was directly affected by it?" And stayed whole. Elena ran her fingers over the papers, still silent. It was a lot to absorb. Since landing, the world seemed to have gained a new speed, and now here she was, with documents from a federal committee in front of her. "Do you want me to testify?" she asked, still uncertain. Her father shook his head. "I want you to participate, to help write the rules. They're tired of speeches. They need someone who understands how these things really happen, in practice, in daily life, in the details no one sees." She took a deep breath. It wasn't just about justice. It was about transforming experience into structure. "All right," she finally said, "but if I'm going to be part of this, it will be my way. No flourishes, No pretty language to disguise what happened. Her father smiled faintly. That's exactly what they were expecting. Inside, Elena felt something she couldn't yet name, a kind of quiet vigor. It wasn't anger, it was something firmer, a sense of purpose slowly emerging where frustration begins to give way to action. In the following days, she was called for a video conference with members of the airline's board. Most of the faces on the screen were well-dressed executives, people accustomed to talking a lot and listening little. But that day, they listened. Elena talked about the flight attendant's gesture, the look that judged her without words, but she also talked about the silences, the ones from the crew who watched without intervening, the passengers who pretended not to notice, the silence from the system that normalized this type of exclusion. At the end of the meeting, the legal director made a promise. We'll review our protocols, but we want more than that. We want you to help us build this new standard. Elena nodded. But it has to be real. I don't want my name on a campaign plaque. I want this change to reach people who will never know who I am. They agreed. And for the first time since boarding that flight, she felt that perhaps something truly new was being set in motion. The next week, Elena's story gained greater proportions. A snippet of her testimony in the video conference was discreetly published by a journalist specialized in civil rights. The speech went viral, not because it was explosive, but precisely because it wasn't. The serene way she described the event, without victimhood but with devastating clarity, touched thousands of people. In less than 48 hours, she received more than 300 direct messages from strangers who said they had experienced something similar. Ordinary people, invisible, who for the first time felt represented by someone who wasn't shouting, but staying on their feet. Among these messages, there was one Elena read twice. It was from a retired flight attendant. The woman said that for years she had been complicit in the system by omission. I saw people being moved to lower seats. I saw passengers being questioned just by the way they dressed or spoke, and I stayed silent. Today, hearing you, I realize what I let pass. And I'm ashamed. Elena replied with just one sentence. It's still time to change, even in silence. And this exchange, so simple, showed her that true change doesn't happen with spotlights, but with awareness. Days later, she was invited to participate in a hearing in the Senate's Transportation Committee to discuss discriminatory practices in commercial aviation. The invitation wasn't to testify as a victim, but to collaborate on building a new code of conduct. She hesitated. She was afraid of becoming a symbol of something she never wanted to represent. But her father, as always, was direct. You're not going for yourself. You're going for all the others who still haven't been able to tell their story. On the day of the hearing, Elena wore simple clothes, a grey blazer, white shirt, dark pants. No uniform, no medals, just the same posture she carried on that flight. Firm, dignified, with no need for explanations. When she stood at the podium and saw the eyes on her, she felt the same nervousness she always did before a mission, but this time the battle was different, and she was ready. The first question came from a veteran senator, known for her direct tone. Sergeant Morris, in your view, what makes this type of discrimination so difficult to fight? Elena took a deep breath before responding. Because it isn't loud, it doesn't come with offense, nor with violence. It comes with doubt, with the look that says, without words, are you sure you belong here? And that hurts just the same, only in silence. The room was silent for a moment, not for lack of an answer, but for the weight of the truth. Another senator asked for examples. Elena gave 3. One about a friend who was prevented from boarding because her afro hair blocked another passenger's view. Another about a Latino sergeant who was sent to the back of the plane because he was wearing gym clothes. And the last one, about an 82-year-old black woman who was the only one whose hand luggage was. They weighed in the first-class line. The difference is never in the rule. It's in how it's applied, she said, and those who decide how to apply it usually decide based on who is in front of them. When she finished speaking, the attendees applauded, but what marked Elena the most was the handshake from an administrative committee staff member, minutes later, off camera. You said what I've lived my whole life and never managed to put into words. The phrase echoed in her throughout the rest of the day. Maybe this was her mission now, to give shape to what so many people feel but can't say, and show that this, too, is strength. On the way back home, In the back seat of the official car that had taken her to the Senate, Elena looked out the window as if searching for a sign that she was on the right path, and in a way she found it. She saw a young woman in Air Force uniform crossing the street, walking quickly with a backpack. Elena smiled to herself. That girl would probably never know her name, but what she did on that flight, and everything that came after, was also for her. In the days that followed, the invitations started to multiply. Interviews, panels, reports. But Elena turned down almost all of them. She didn't want to be the face of a campaign, or the symbol of a cause that would soon be shelved. She preferred to work behind the scenes, where the real decisions were made. Her focus was on the code of conduct that she and a technical team began drafting, a protocol to prevent discriminatory approaches based on evidence, behavior, and not assumptions. It was exhausting. It required patience. But she knew that's where real change resided. During one of the meetings with the working group, one of the airline's directors asked a question that caught her off guard. "Would you still fly with us?" Elena looked directly at him. It wasn't a quick response. She thought about the glances that pretended not to see. She thought about the hand on her arm, the coldness of being moved. But she also thought about the apology, the younger flight attendant who changed her posture, and the small things that began to change. "Yes," she replied, "but not for the same reasons as before. Now, I'd fly to make sure no one else goes through what I went through." At home at night, Elena returned to the old habit of writing in a black notebook she had kept since her first year at base. She wrote down feelings she didn't know how to name at the time. "Today, I understood that what hurt me the most on that flight wasn't being removed. It was how quickly it happened, as if it were normal, as if I was indeed invading a space." On another page, she wrote, "The blame wasn't just on the company, it was on the culture, and culture only changes with persistence." One of those nights of writing, her mother entered the room with a cup of tea and said something she had never said before. "Do you remember the time I almost got removed from a meeting at school because they thought I was a colleague's babysitter?" Elena's eyes widened. "Why didn't you tell me this? Because I thought the right thing was to move on. But now, seeing you face this head-on, I realize maybe I should have spoken up, at least once." And in that conversation between mother and daughter, Elena understood she was breaking a silence that had been passed down through generations. In the days that followed, Elena began to notice subtle changes in the environments she walked through. At the local airport, she saw updated signs with messages about respect for diversity and ethical conduct. The notices were discreet but clear. On a train trip to a meeting with a group of retired military personnel, she was approached by a station employee who simply said, "Thank you. What you're doing is helping more people than you realize." It was strange to hear this. She never imagined herself as someone who was doing something big. She was just trying to correct something that should never have happened. At one of those meetings, Elena was approached by an older, elegant woman with a strong expression. "My name is Evelyn. I was a team leader on commercial flights for 30 years. I know what happened to you. I've seen it happen. I've let it happen." Elena listened attentively. Evelyn continued, "We get used to following orders, maintaining the standard, but the standard was wrong." There was something heavy and liberating in that outburst. They spoke for over an hour, and when they parted, Evelyn said, "Maybe I'm too late to change, but you're not." Back at the committee, Elena began leading the creation of a training module focused on unconscious bias for flight attendants and service staff. It wasn't easy. Many employees resisted. Some said it was an exaggeration, others thought it was too much politics. But others, the silent majority, listened. They reflected, and they started to see what had previously seemed invisible. Real change begins when someone feels ashamed of something they once thought was normal, Elena wrote in her notebook. During the pilot module presentation, she chose not to use slides. She just told the story, not with anger, but with all the details. The touch on the arm, the ignored ticket, the silence of those who watched. At the end, a young flight attendant raised her hand. "How do we make sure this doesn't happen again?" Elena smiled faintly. "First, by recognizing that it can happen, even to us. And then by staying vigilant, because not everyone will be able to react the way I did." The room fell silent. But this time, it was the right kind of silence. As time passed, Elena realized that the biggest changes weren't in the meetings or reports, but in the spontaneous conversations that followed. It was in the corridors, the coffee breaks, the messages at improbable hours, that people truly opened up. A veteran flight attendant confided that for years he had felt ashamed of his indigenous roots and hid his surname on his uniform badge. Seeing you up there talking about your name, your story, made me think, maybe I don't need to hide anymore. And that, for her, meant something was working. She was also being approached by smaller groups, almost invisible within the aviation hierarchy. Ground crew, maintenance technicians, cleaning staff, people who rarely had space to voice opinions, but who saw and heard much more than the executives imagined. The difference starts down below, they said. Elena began to listen to these voices with special attention, because she knew a policy is only fair when it reaches those who don't have a microphone. One afternoon, after a meeting, Elena was surprised by a reporter from the national news. "Do you think what happened to you has become a symbol?" The question bothered her, not because it was malicious, but because it carried a trap. She thought before responding, "I'm not a symbol. I'm just someone who refused to accept a rule that never made sense. If that inspires someone, fine. But my goal was never to make headlines, it was to make sure silence didn't win again." That same night, she returned home and found her father watching the evening news. The story showed images of updated panels in airlines, new approach policies, and testimonials from employees who had adopted new attitudes. At the end of the report, there was a brief statement from her at the hearing. Elena stopped at the door, watching in silence. Harold simply looked at the screen, then at his daughter and said, "It's not a symbol, it's structure." She sat on the couch, took a deep breath and thought, maybe both were right. With the progress of initiatives, Elena started traveling more, not as a military officer, but as an invited consultant. She visited training centers, operational bases, and even technical schools that trained future aviation professionals. Everywhere she went, she heard stories. Some reminded her of hers, others were even more subtle, more hidden. "They always put me to serve at the back, even when I've been here longer," said a young receptionist in training. Eleanor just wrote it down. It wasn't her job to solve everything on her own, but she made sure to bring each case to the decision-making table. During a seminar in Seattle, a student approached her after the lecture. She was nervous but determined. "Do you think it's worth continuing in this career despite all of this?" Elena didn't hesitate. "It's worth it. But not because of the system, because of the people we can protect within it." That was the idea that moved her now, that resisting wasn't just about staying, but about making room, creating gaps where there were once blockages, and allowing other people to go further with fewer wounds. On one of those trips, she unexpectedly ran into a familiar face. Christine Adler, the flight attendant who had moved her from the seat on the flight months before. They were at the same airport on opposite terminals when their gazes met. Christine walked toward Elena, hesitant. When she stopped in front of her, there was a mix of shame and honesty in her expression. "I didn't come to apologize again. I came to say that I requested a transfer. I'm now in the training department. I thought that if I couldn't change what I did, maybe I could help prevent it from happening again." Elena listened in silence. There was no bitterness on her face, just clarity. "You understood," she said, "and that's already something." Christine nodded. "Thank you for not yelling at me that day." Elena replied, "I didn't yell, but I spoke, and sometimes that weighs more." They parted without hugs, without forced affection, but with something more important, clarity. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes, but it felt like a cycle had closed there, with both feet on the ground of a crowded terminal. After that unexpected reunion, Eleanor's mind raced for hours, not out of anger or discomfort, but because of what that brief conversation represented. Change didn't come with medals or headlines. It came when someone recognized they had failed and decided to do things differently. And if even someone like Christine had taken a step, it meant that the seeds were germinating. For the first time, Elena began to believe that she wasn't just reacting to an injustice. She was helping to build a new base of awareness. At home that same night, she received an envelope in the mail. It was from the airline. Inside there was a formal letter, signed by the new chairman of the board. The letter publicly acknowledged the mistake, detailed the new measures underway, and invited Elena to a strategic planning meeting. But what caught her attention most was the final paragraph. "We now understand that your gesture was not just a reaction. It was a call to responsibility. We want this to never again depend on the individual courage of someone like you to happen. Elena closed the envelope and looked at it for a while. It was strange to see, black on white, the acknowledgement that so many people had waited for years without receiving. She knew that the letter didn't fix the past, but it served as a milestone, a point at which the company stopped denying and began participating in the repair process. She kept the letter in the same folder where the committee's notes were, as if it were another piece in the slow construction of what she called institutional memory. Days later, during another round of training, a young employee approached her after the session. He was shy, looking no older than 25. "I'm new here," he said. "I didn't experience any of this, but I've heard about it, and I just wanted to say that the way you spoke made me see my role in this. I used to think it was just a job. Now I understand that it's also a choice, every day." Elena smiled and replied, "If you've understood this so early, you're years ahead of where many start." And in that moment, she was sure that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Over the months, Elena began to perceive a new kind of challenge, keeping the flame of change alive when the spotlight faded. The initial reverberation of her story had diminished, the headlines had shifted, the videos stopped circulating so frequently. But to her, that wasn't a problem. In fact, it was the clearest sign that she was entering the most important phase, the part where transformation stops being news and becomes routine. That was where she wanted to be, in the hard part, the part no one celebrates but that sustains everything. She began working on revising internal airline manuals, adapting language, protocols, and decision-making flows, things that, for many, seemed like details, but for someone who had already been a victim of exclusion, made all the difference. "When the system fails, the detail becomes damage," she said in meetings. Some listened with true attention, others out of obligation, but she learned to recognize the difference and focus her energy where there was fertile ground. Her goal wasn't to convince everyone, it was to change enough so the rest became obsolete. One day, while visiting a training center in southern Florida, Elena saw a mural with quotes from leaders and inspiring figures. Among them, one quote attributed to her was written in small but highlighted letters. "It's not your presence that bothers, it's the fact that you don't leave when they try to push you out." She didn't know who put it there, but she stood still for a long time looking at it, not out of vanity, but because she felt that, among so many words of generic motivation, someone had understood what she truly meant that day on the plane. At the end of that visit, a cleaning staff member approached her in the hallway. "Sorry to bother you," she said with some shyness, "but I saw the video, and I just wanted to thank you." Elena smiled, extended her hand and replied, "You're not bothering. You belong." It was a few words, but they carried the same message that had guided everything from the beginning. No one should have to fight to prove they have the right to be where they are. On the way back home that same night, Elena sat on the couch with the old notebook in her lap, the same one she had been writing in since the beginning of her journey. The pages were full, some with hasty scribbles, others with carefully thought-out phrases. But that night required a new note. She wrote, slowly, as if every word needed to be felt. "The hardest fight is the one we continue even after everyone forgets it started." She closed the notebook and left it on the coffee table. It wasn't a closure, just another pause. A few days later, she was invited to participate in a roundtable discussion with young apprentices in the aviation sector. Young people, full of questions, and often unaware of what happens beyond the boarding instructions. Elena started telling her story, but soon opened the floor for questions. A thin boy with quick speech asked, "But what if no one believes me when something happens?" She looked at him and said, "If you know you're right, keep going anyway. Sometimes we need to be the first to believe that what we feel is real." That speech silenced the room. But soon a young woman sitting in the last chair raised her hand. "Do you regret doing all that?" Elena thought for a moment. "I don't regret it, but there were days I wanted to stay quiet. Because fighting is tiring, because sometimes no one sees, but it's exactly on those days that we understand why we started." There was a faint murmur of agreement in the room. And right there, among that generation just starting out, she felt something close to hope. After the event, as she walked to the parking lot, Elena received a call. It was from the senator's office, who chaired the transportation committee. "We're moving forward with the bill on ethics and conduct in passenger service, and we'd like you to join the approval session. Not as a guest, but as a co-author of the text." She stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, phone in hand, and the wind on her face. "Of course," she replied. "If it's going to be recorded, I want it to be clear why it all matters. No one should be treated as an exception where they have a right to be." The approval of the bill was scheduled for a Wednesday morning in a large, quiet hall, with dozens of chairs arranged in rows and a central table reserved for the reporters. Elena arrived early, as she did with any commitment she took seriously. She dressed simply, a dark suit, her hair tied back, no visible insignia. She didn't want to be seen as military, nor as a symbol, but as a citizen, someone who had been pushed out and returned without asking for permission, and this time, to help change the entrance door. During the ceremony, her name was mentioned several times, but never exaggeratedly, just enough to mark her participation as part of the structure of what was now becoming law. When the text was read aloud, she closed her eyes for a second. Words like mandatory verification, anti-bias training, and review of standardized conduct sounded different when recorded in the minutes. It was more than protocol. It was memory. It was a formal reminder that what had been done to her, even without shouting, was violence, and now there were consequences. At the end, the senator invited her to say a few words. Elena stood up slowly, walked to the microphone, and looked around the room. What happened to me could have happened to anyone else, and it does every day. The difference is that on that day, someone heard me. But what hurt me the most was thinking about how many others were treated the same way, and stayed silent. That's why this law matters, not because it protects me, but because it protects those who don't even know they will need it. Applause echoed in the room, but Elena didn't smile. She simply nodded, returned to her seat. It wasn't about victory, it was about responsibility. As she left the building, she felt the warm sun on her face, and thought about her mother, Christine, the boy from the lecture, the woman from cleaning, the station employee. It was for them too, for everyone who had similar stories, but without a stage, without a letterhead, without an answer, and now, maybe, with a little more space to breathe. In the days following the approval of the law, Elena avoided interviews. She kept her phone on silent mode and spent more time at home, returning to old habits, cooking something simple, taking care of the plants, walking through the neighborhood as she had before the mission that changed her life. It wasn't escape, it was rest. The soul also needs pauses after so much exposure, and she knew that in order to sustain real changes, it would be necessary to preserve her emotional health. There was still much work ahead, but for a moment, it was only right to breathe. On a rainy afternoon, she went back to flipping through her notebook. On one of the most recent pages, there was a phrase underlined twice. "It's not about winning the argument. It's about making sure the next person doesn't have to go through the same thing to be heard." That summed it all up. Elena knew her name was in minutes, in documents, in official records, but what mattered most was what would remain in everyday life, in the more humane approaches, in the tickets checked with respect, in the voices that would now be taken seriously before needing to defend themselves. One morning, while boarding for a personal trip, for the first time in a long while, Elena was recognized by an airport employee. The woman didn't make a fuss. She just smiled and said with a firm whisper, "Thank you for doing what you did the way you did it." Elena nodded and walked to the boarding gate. Her ticket was again in business class, but now bought with miles earned from work, not as a gift of reparation. As she sat down, she didn't feel the fear of being interrupted. She felt something different, belonging, a clean silence. Before takeoff, she grabbed her phone and sent a single message to her father. This time, no one asked if the seat was mine. On the other end, Harold read and simply replied, "It was. It always was." Elena put her phone away, leaned back in her seat, and closed her eyes. The flight departed minutes later, cutting through the clouds with the lightness that only those who have carried much weight understand. There was no announcement, no tribute, but there was peace. And for her, that was more than enough. Upon arrival, Elena disembarked without hurry. She carried only a backpack, no uniform, no symbols. But anyone who looked closely would notice the firmness in her walk, the direct gaze, the absence of haste. It wasn't arrogance, It was the confidence of someone who no longer needed to explain why she was there. At the gate, no one was waiting for her with signs or flowers. Still, she felt she had completed something. Not a military mission, but a human mission. One that began without warning, with a touch on the arm, and ended with a place occupied with dignity. Later, while having lunch alone at a discreet restaurant in the city center, she overheard a group at the next table talking about travel, delays, flights, and airlines. One of the men casually mentioned, "Now they're more careful," after that case of the woman who was moved. "From first class, do you remember?" No one remembered her name, but everyone knew what it was about. Elena smiled to herself. She didn't mind the forgetting of her name. What mattered was that the case had turned into a lesson, and that was enough. That night, back at the hotel, she looked out the window at the city lights. She thought about the many people who crossed her path, and those she would never see, but who might one day be treated with more respect because of what she had lived. People who wouldn't know her face, her tone of voice, but who would have the chance to continue their journey without being interrupted because of the color of their skin, the name on their ticket, or the uniform they carried. It was for these people that everything had been worth it. Before going to bed, she opened the notebook one last time. On the last blank page, she wrote only, "The passage wasn't what placed me there. It was the entire story that brought me here." Then she closed the notebook, turned off the light, and allowed herself to rest. For the first time in a long time, without carrying on her shoulders the task of correcting the world, but with the certainty that she had done her part, and that, from now on, others would also do theirs. In the following days, Elena returned to her routine with a lighter pace. Not that the work had diminished, but her approach to it had changed. Now, she could look at everything with a little more distance. The weight of urgency had given way to the clarity of continuity. She knew she wouldn't solve everything on her own, and that far from being demotivating was liberating. She understood that her role now was to sustain what had already been built, pass on tools, and train people. The change no longer lived inside her, it was spreading, and that was exactly where she wanted to be. One afternoon, she received an invitation to participate in a roundtable at a local university for young black women in professional training. Elena almost declined. She thought it might be too much, but something inside her told her that she needed to go. When she arrived, she found a small room with about 20 students. No cameras, no famous names, no ceremonial events, just attentive gazes and sincere questions. There she spoke differently, less technical, more personal. She talked about the fears she felt, about the times she wanted to disappear, and about how even silence can be used as strength. One of the young women asked, "Do you think things like this will still happen, even with all that has changed?" Elena answered without hesitation, "Yes, it will happen, because changing the system takes time. But now, whoever does it will think twice, and whoever suffers will know they are no longer alone." That's what she wanted to leave behind, not a promise of perfection, but the certainty that there were paths, that no longer would it be necessary to face everything in silence, like so many generations before her. On the way out, one of the students ran up to her in the parking lot and handed her a small handmade envelope. "You don't need to open it now. I just wanted you to know that what you did helped me believe that I can also be in places they told me I didn't belong." Elena held the envelope firmly. She looked into the young woman's eyes and said, "Then don't give up, because you're exactly who this place needs." And in that moment, she felt she had left something. Not a mark, but a seed. That same night, back at home, Elena opened the envelope from the young student. Inside was a handwritten letter. The handwriting was careful, but there was hesitation between the words. The girl wrote that she had given up twice on selection processes because she felt out of place in the hallways where most people didn't look like her. She said she thought the problem was hers, until she saw someone like Elena occupying spaces that once seemed unreachable. "You showed me I'm not an exception, that the problem is the structure, not my presence," said the last line. Elena read it more than once in silence. With the envelope still in her hands, Elena looked around the room. There were family portraits, the military academy diploma, the closed notebook on the coffee table. All of it told her story, but now she realized she was also part of the story of other people, people she might never meet. but who would now have a less harsh path to walk. And that awareness was powerful. Because what begins with an act of exclusion sometimes ends with the creation of a new trail, where others will walk more whole. In the days that followed, she wrote one final text, not for the newspapers nor for the speeches. It was a personal account, meant for a small newsletter from an NGO that worked with inclusion in work environments. In it, she wrote, "I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who refused to accept a rule that never made sense. And I'm still here because I understood that even when the pain becomes routine, dignity can still be a choice." She sent the text without expecting a return. She just left it recorded, because words have power, even when they aren't seen. On the last page of the notebook, next to the previous phrase, Elena scribbled in small handwriting, "Now I can finally follow in peace, because I know that even if they take my seat, they'll never take my place." And with that, she closed the final chapter of a journey that began in silence, marked by simple gestures, and ended exactly as it started, with truth, without fanfare, without an audience, but with a lasting effect that, like everything that truly matters, happens inwardly and spreads in silence.